Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was having some technical difficulties. Too many Bluetooth devices trying to connect to me, and the Bluetooth device that I want to connect was not connecting. Did you guys enjoy having Thursday off and then Friday not with me?
It was almost the same as having a whole week off.
Was it now? It didn't feel that way to me at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I assume that was sarcasm, Kelsey.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. I drove to Texas and back via Oklahoma City. Zach and I are working on a project for his senior thesis where we are looking at latitudinal variation in an introduced species. This is a species, the Mediterranean gecko, which I have one of right here in my office, actually. Oh, no. This is a Mediterranean gecko biting me on the finger. This is a species that was introduced into the United States back in the early 1900s in Florida. It was introduced into Texas in the 1950s. It proceeded to then expand its range northward. And so normally when we think about, this is not going to be on the test, but it kind of ties in with what we've been talking about with thermoregulation. As it has moved north, it's moved from areas where it's warm to areas where it's cold. And normally when we think about thermoregulation and how it impacts ectotherms, when you normally think of rising temperature because of global warming, creating temperatures that are too warm for organisms, and as a result, they suffer stress that way. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the thermoregulation lecture, you also have to think about it on the cool side as well. And in this case, we have a species that is from the Mediterranean region, a place that's relatively warm, moves to the southern United States where it's relatively warm, but then has proceeded to expand its range as far north as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for example, where it can get quite cold at certain times of the year. And what Zach and I are doing is we're trying to look at what are the implications of this organism that evolved in warm environments and is now expanding its range into cold environments. And one of the things that we think is happening is that in Oklahoma City, where there's a population at the University of Central Oklahoma, that population has a very reduced reproductive season because it takes it a while to warm up in the spring and it starts getting cold relatively early in the year. And we've already seen that there's some differences in their thermal physiology from some work that Jacob Marley did, a former student of mine did, looking at the temperature dependence of sprint speed, looking at these performance curves of how an individual performs at a physiological task at different temperatures. But what we also learned in the process of doing that is that the geckos in northern latitudes are bigger than the geckos in southern latitudes. And so we think that what may be happening is that because the northern geckos have a reduced reproductive season, they put less energy into reproduction, which means they can put more energy into growth and maintenance, whereas the geckos down in Galveston are potentially reproducing multiple times during the year. As a result, they're putting comparatively more energy into reproduction. They have less energy to put into growth and maintenance. And as a result, this leads to these size disparities between the populations. But of course, in order to answer that question, we have to know when the geckos are coming into reproductive activity and when they're done with reproduction at the end of the year. I've collected geckos in Galveston all the way into October that were still carrying eggs. which is quite late in the year. In Oklahoma City, by October, activity is kind of shutting down. They're not even active on the walls much anymore. And so what I did this past week, while I wasn't in class on Friday, is I went and I sampled Oklahoma City and Galveston and didn't find any geckos that were reproductively active. And then I assumed that Nacogdoches, which is about halfway between Oklahoma City and Galveston, I assumed that if there were no reproductive animals in Galveston, there also wouldn't be any in Nacogdoches. So I got to come back a day early, actually. So I spent a lot of time in the car over this past 4 days or so, 5 days. So that's kind of that. I brought back one gecko because I wanted to put one gecko in the collection. So this is a species that in the time that I've been teaching this class has been introduced into Missouri. There's a population in Joplin, and there's also a population in St. Louis. So it is a representative, a reptile that is represented in Missouri now that is not in our collection. So all of the ones that we do have on hand that are preserved have been cut open for stomach content analysis. So they're not particularly good for looking at for identification because they're all hacked open by a former student of mine. There's also a population that was recently discovered down in Olathe at a trucking depot. So one of the things about this species is that it tends to be distributed through human facilitated dispersal, and so you tend to see it appearing at things like trucking depots, and the pattern of their spread is very closely tied to the road network in the United States. So that is that. I sent you your graded literature reviews from the first paper. The second paper is in the schedule to be discussed on Wednesday, but we won't discuss it until Friday because we are about a day behind in terms of what the schedule says. So it is up online on Moodle, and take feedback from the course, from the literature summary that I just handed back to you, and make any changes you need to make as you read the next paper. The next paper has to do with this idea of the thermal constraints of reptiles in particular, and what this means in a warming world. And so they take this kind of really broad global perspective and say, okay, what is predicted to happen in the world in terms of global climate change? And in a warming world, what does this mean for the fate of reptiles in this case, but the same could also be said of amphibians in many of these cases. You'll recall that I told you last week that a guy named Barry Sinervo died, and I went and looked at his TED Talk, and his TED Talk was all about the extinction of reptile communities being driven by climate change, by increasing global temperatures. So this is one of those issues that is on the mind of anybody who works with amphibians or reptiles, and because they are affected by climate change much more so than, for example, a homeotherm, an individual, species that generates its body heat metabolically. So that is the topic for Friday. So Kiara has already led discussion, so Kiara is off the hook. Kiara, that doesn't mean that you should not read and prepare. It just means that you will not be in charge of guiding discussion.
So does that mean the lit sum is due on Friday also? Like we're maybe
What?
good. So does that mean the lit sum?
Lit sum.
Okay.
Yeah. No point in turning in the lit summary until we're ready to talk about the paper.
I just want to clarify. Thank you.
Yep. And I think the date is on the Moodle assignment, although I can't remember if I put it there. Right. Yeah, but yeah, always the day that we discuss it is when the literature summary is due. All right, so the next chapter in your textbook is on energy and performance. And I forget what chapter this is, actually. I was just reading it earlier today. Chapter 7. So let me share my screen with you. All right. So learning goals for kind of this chapter. Ultimately, the energy that you have is going to be limited by a number of things. One of the things that limits it is the metabolic pathways that you have for generating energy. So what molecules do you use for energy, and how do those get broken down to create energy? But another aspect that limits you is your ability to handle the byproducts of metabolism, and also to get your body the raw materials that you need for metabolism. So there's a certain amount of thinking about energy and energy use in amphibians and reptiles that is going to be focused on gas exchange mechanisms. And so if you have an aerobic metabolism that requires the input of a lot of oxygen, then your ability to oxygenate your blood is going to place an upper limit on kind of how much energy you can produce. And one of the things with reptiles is that their ways of ventilating, amphibians and reptiles, is their way of ventilating their lungs varies a lot across the different groups, and it also has certain constraints built into the system that kind of limit the ability of animals to get enough oxygen into their body and to get rid of enough CO2 as CO2 is generated as a byproduct of metabolism. So a big part of this, of today's time, will be spent on gas exchange mechanisms and the role of gas exchange in facilitating energy production. Part of this is also going to then be impacted by the ability of the circulatory system to move blood around, because blood delivers not only the molecules that are responsible for being broken down to liberate energy, but also the things like oxygen that you need for energy production, and blood is important at getting rid of CO2. So circulatory adaptations can affect gas exchange and energy production. And we'll also get a little more into how circulatory adaptations can influence thermoregulation. There's a little section of that as well in here. And so then the last things that we're going to look at is more of kind of a physiological treatment of how different groups of organisms use ATP. If you take a human physiology class, which some of you I think have taken, we come away from most studies in universities thinking, oh, there's one way to utilize ATP, but there are actually a variety of ways of utilizing ATP, and amphibians and reptiles do things quite different in some cases from the way mammals do them. And then there's this general idea that there are energetic trade-offs in amphibians and reptiles, in that kind of the thing that we were talking about with geckos a minute ago. You have a certain pool of energy that you have to use on all of your daily activities. How do you then invest that energy? Do you invest that energy in acquiring more energy by going out and foraging and chasing down food? Do you invest that energy in reproduction? Do you invest that energy in growth, becoming a bigger individual, rather than merely maintaining your body from day to day? And any energy that you put into one activity is energy that you don't have to invest in another activity. So that's the nature of a trade-off. And hopefully the idea of trade-offs is not an idea that is new to you. Questions about that? All right. This is the simple equation for what process? What would this equation be describing?
Cellular respiration.
Yeah, it's cellular respiration. We take glucose molecules, we oxidize them with oxygen, and we create two low energy molecules, water and carbon dioxide. And in the process, we generate energy. Because we require oxygen to facilitate cellular respiration, we need to have ways of bringing oxygen into the body so that it is in contact with cells that are doing this. And CO2 is generated. It diffuses into the bloodstream, and then we have to get rid of that CO2 from the bloodstream. And we generally exhale that in humans. It might diffuse across the skin if you're in something like a frog. So when we think about energy, we can think about glucose, but we can also think about, well, in the process of processing glucose to gain the energy that is pent up in glucose, we have to also think about what these other molecules are that are required for cellular respiration. How do we acquire oxygen, and then how do we get rid of the byproduct of CO2? And that's what the first part of this chapter deals with. So because we are humans, we tend to think as humans do, and so we tend to think of lungs as the main organ that is involved in gas exchange. But of course, if you are an amphibian, in some cases, what's a group of amphibians that don't even have lungs?
The plethodontids.
The plethodontids, yeah. So in the case of the plethodonid salamanders, there is no pulmonary gas exchange because they don't even possess lungs. And so all of their gas exchange is going to be accomplished across the skin. And so we'll talk about some adaptations that organisms have to facilitate gas exchange across the skin. Then there's what's called Bucopharyngeal gas exchange. When you see that term bucopharyngeal, what do you think of? What do you think that refers to? What does the pharynx refer to? Pharynx.
It's basically when they use the muscles of the mouth and the throat for gas
Okay,
exchange.
so the pharynx is this area up in here, and the buccal cavity is actually the mouth cavity. So bucopharyngeal gas exchange is any gas exchange that occurs up here in the mouth cavity and the throat. And so you have an epithelial lining to your mouth and throat. In amphibians and in some cases turtles and things like this, that epithelial lining is well supplied with capillaries, and it's thin enough that you can get significant amounts of gas exchange across the lining of the mouth and the upper throat. And so you can have that as a source of gas exchange. And then also in terms of lungs, if you are an amphibian and you have lungs, in many cases, the lungs might be used for gas exchange, but they're just as likely just to be used as a form of buoyancy. And this is especially true if you happen to be a salamander that actually lives most of their lives in water. You would see the lungs used more for buoyancy than for gas exchange. So when we think about cutaneous gas exchange across the skin, what are some adaptations that you might expect to see in organisms that might increase the effectiveness of cutaneous gas exchange. Gas exchange across the skin. We've already looked at one of these in passing when we talked about the hellbender and the giant salamanders, Cryptobranchus, and the giant salamanders of Asia. For any organ that is going to be involved in absorbing substances, what's the thing that you want to do with that organ to increase its ability to absorb a substance?
They want to increase the surface area of the skin. So they have like the skin folds and the cryptobranchids, or any like tails or extra skin extensions that form.
Okay, so yeah, increasing surface area. So if you think about your lungs, you have a trachea. The trachea goes down to the bronchi split, and then you go through this series of finer and finer bifurcations of the tubes that are ultimately going to the alveoli in the lung. And the reason that you're breaking your lungs up into these smaller and smaller pockets is in your alveoli, what you have is you have a great deal of surface area of your pulmonary epithelium that is exposed to the air spaces inside of your lungs. And so whether you're talking about the structure of the lung or if you're talking about the structure of the skin, one of the primary ways that you can increase the ability of those organs to transfer, in this case, gases from in an amphibian from the water or the air into the bloodstream, and to transfer carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream into the water or the air, is to increase the amount of surface area that you have available for that. And so what we see in Cryptobranchus alleganiensis is you see all of these complex folds of skin. These are believed to be an adaptation that is designed to increase the surface area of this animal. This animal lives its life exclusively in water. It doesn't really come up for air at all. You only tend to find Cryptobranchus in really clean, highly oxygenated bodies of water. So think of these clear running rocky streams that are on the cold side that run throughout the Ozarks here in Missouri. Because the water temperature is cool water tends to hold more oxygen than warm water does. And because these areas are relatively shallow and are rocky, there's a lot of riffle zones. Those riffle zones allow for the mixture of air and water as the stream flows, which also serves to oxygenate the water. So these are animals that occur in highly oxygenated water, and they have also developed these folds to increase the surface area of their skin that is in contact with the water, because they breathe primarily through cutaneous gas exchange. Here's a picture of a frog that once again has all of these complex folds around the head, down the arms. These also serve to increase the surface area for gas exchange. This is a situation where the African hairy frog, once again, one of these aquatic frogs, has these hairs. They're not really hairs. What they are is they're extensions of the epidermis that look hair-like. And around each of these little finger-like extensions, you have a great deal of surface area that is available around that hair for the transport of oxygen. And you can also see that these hairs appear red. Why would they be appearing red?
Due to the blood of the animal, since it should be vascularized.
Yeah, so what you see is these are basically kind of acting like little cutaneous gills. Blood is flowing out into these hairs. It's oxygenated as it goes out into these hairs, and as a result, it turns a brighter red than when it's deoxygenated. And so the reddishness of these hairs is due to the fact that these are vascularized, once again indicating that this is an adaptation to increase gas exchange by increasing the surface area of the epidermis in this case. We also see that in newts, this is the smooth newt from Europe, you will see that during mating season, the males in particularly will grow these elaborate fins that start on the back and extend onto the tail. These fins have multiple purposes. What might some of the purposes of this fin be?
It can serve as a mating display.
Okay.
Also,
Go ahead.
Also for, again, like cutaneous respiration, increasing surface area.
Yeah. So when these guys, so this typically only occurs during mating season. When they're out of mating season, they look more like a normal salamander without this crest. So one of the purposes of this, and we'll talk about this when we talk about mating systems later in the semester, is it can be a sexual display, and it can be a sexual display one of two ways. It can be used to display to males. Oftentimes, when you're competing for a territory, you don't compete through physical contests as much as you compete through displays. And one of the ways that you can discourage another male from trying to take over your territory is by simply looking bigger than them. And so you'll see this in a bunch of different amphibian or reptile groups. They will turn and they'll face one, and they won't face one another head on. They'll face such that their sides are directed towards one another, and they can see the profile of the other. And they basically compare kind of who's the biggest one. The biggest one keeps the territory, and the smaller one goes off and tries to find another territory. And so this projection of size is important in these male-male contests. You also see this with humans in a bar. If you have ever been involved, how many of you have ever been involved in a bar fight? Really? I'm the only one who's ever been in a bar fight. Okay. When you're at a Dead King's Pillow concert and you're there with your other graduate student friends, and Chris Brown's wife is with him, and this dude who's totally drunk spills his beer all over Chris Brown's wife, and then Chris Brown's wife takes the guy's hand and tips the beer that he is holding onto his chest. Things escalate very quickly because she's pissed because she had beer spilled all over her, and now he is pissed because she has very purposefully spilled beer all over him. And then his two friends come up, and Chris's 5 graduate student friends come up, and you have a bunch of dudes who are in graduate school and are too young to know any better about to get in a throwdown. And what do those dudes immediately do when they confront one another? What happens to their physical presence when they do this? Maybe you've seen a bar fight in a movie. You guys have never seen a bar fight in a movie even.
Will you try and get big and then match up with somebody who's your size?
You stand up straight, you throw your chest out, and you try and make yourself look as big as you can possibly look. Because if you can get the other dude to stand down because you look big, and I do not look big, it's always small people who get into fights because they just don't know any better. But if you can make yourself look as big as possible, you make it such that the other person doesn't want to tangle with you. And so whether it's a territorial dispute at a bar or a territorial dispute in a pond, the fact of the matter is one of the ways that you can prevail in these without actually becoming into physical confrontation, which you want to avoid at all costs because it risks damaging you and it risks damaging the other individual. So there's the possibility for physical damage, is to just make yourself look bigger. Now, in this case, making yourself look bigger is good for dissuading males from taking your territory, but also if being big makes you able to hold a territory, females might also think that you're attractive because you are big, because if they breed with you, they will produce offspring that will also be big and will have good abilities to hold territories when they become adults. And so there's also an incentive for females to mate with bigger males as well, which is why in some cases, well, in many cases around the world, when you see sexual dimorphism, it's oftentimes the male that is the bigger individual in the species as opposed to the female, which is smaller. That's in species where male-male competition is important in determining the outcome of mating contests. In situations where fitness is more closely tied to female reproductive capacity, you'll see that the females are the larger in the species because the bigger they are, the more offspring they can produce. And so you'll see sexual dimorphism going in the opposite direction. So the direction of sexual dimorphism depends largely on kind of what the fitness consequences are of being big as a male versus being big as a female. But aside from those mating functions of large size, there's also the added advantage of this increases the surface area that is available for cutaneous gas exchange. Now imagine that you're a male, you're vigorously defending your territory, you need to be exchanging a lot of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so having this large fin, this large dorsal crest, also has the added benefit of increasing your aerobic capacity for doing all of this defending. And so we used to think of these kinds of displays as simply manifestations of sexual selection, either provided by males on other males through male-male competition, or provided by females through female choice. But knowing what we know now about respiratory exchange, it may be that neither of those is correct, that maybe this evolved as a mechanism for increasing cutaneous gas exchange in these territorial competitions, and then it had the secondary benefit of facing down males and attracting females. And so knowing what the exact selective force that has led to these modifications is a little tricky to tease apart sometimes. And I've got something in my throat, and I need to find my water bottle so that I can continue talking. Ah, there it is. So gas exchange is important in adults, and it is also important in larvae. What's the challenge of being a developing embryo inside of an egg? You're an amphibian larva, you're inside of an egg, floating around in a body of water. From a gas exchange standpoint, what's the challenge there? you want to simplify an egg to its most base components, you have a yolk that serves as the energy supply for the egg, for the developing embryo, and then that yolk, at least in a teleolecithal egg, is surrounded by albumin. That albumin is mainly made up of what class of biological compounds? Think of a chicken egg. What is that clear substance around the yolk made up of?
Is it just water and proteins?
Yeah, it's mainly proteins. Yeah, sure. So you have this proteinaceous substance surrounding the embryo. The embryo is more closely associated with the yolk. What does that protein, what does those layers of protein provide as a challenge to the developing embryo? Wrap anything up in protein, what are you going to have trouble getting access to? I'll give you a hint. We're talking about it today.
Like gases won't be able to diffuse through that layer.
Yeah, it's just harder for gases to diffuse through that layer. And so we're talking about gas exchange. So it's kind of like church, you know, question is asked, chances are something about gas exchange is going to be the answer, in the same way that if you're in Sunday school, chances are Jesus is going to be the answer. You can always go with Jesus in church. So the egg is designed to protect the developing embryo. And the problem with putting something in a protective encasement, in this case, the encasement is the egg, while you're protecting it from things that could harm the embryo, that protection also has a potential to protect the embryo from things that are actually good for it, like getting enough oxygen and being able to get rid of carbon dioxide. This is true whether you're in an amphibian egg. How does that equation change when you move from an amphibian egg to a reptilian egg? Please, somebody other than Elizabeth Ellis. Yes, Elizabeth, you're on mute for the rest of the class period. Once again, it's not a punishment, it's a recognition that everybody else needs to step up. What's different about a reptilian egg versus an amphibian egg?
Doesn't the reptile egg have a harder shell?
Yeah, it has a harder, thicker shell. In the case of lizards and a lot of turtles, it's a parchment shelled egg, so it's flexible and it's somewhat more permeable than a hard shelled egg. But then when you start adding layers of calcium carbonate to the egg, that egg becomes even less permeable to things like oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so there are special modifications in the egg, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that actually facilitate this. There's an internal structure to the egg that allows air to diffuse through the egg. So in the case of amphibians, to kind of get over this impediment that the protective layers of the egg provide, they have developed a variety of different mechanisms for improving gas exchange. And so anything that has direct development where the individual goes through all of its larval development inside of the egg. So this would be things like plethodon and salamanders. This would be things like eleutherodactylid frogs and things like certain species of caecilians. So here we have a salamander, here we have a very angry looking frog, and here we have a caecilian. In all of these cases, there have been elaborations of the gills, elaborations of the tail, and once again, in the caecilians, an amazing elaboration in the gills, in these big membranous, flat membranous gills that are found in the caecilians that basically allow the larva to increase the surface area of the respiratory surface. And in many cases, they will actually press these respiratory surfaces up against the edge of the egg, much in the same way that organisms will move themselves around within the egg for some regulatory reasons. And so they've developed modifications of in some cases, the regular gill structures, or in some cases, a structure that hasn't traditionally been thought of as being involved in respiration as a mechanism to increase the contact of the embryo with the edges of the egg to increase gas exchange. So the situation in reptiles is different because you have scales that prevent a lot of cutaneous respiration. An exception to this are sea snakes, where there is quite a lot of cutaneous respiration that goes on. And so reptiles rely much more so on their lungs for gas exchange, but they also will rely on cloacal and bucopharyngeal gas exchange, especially in turtles. So if you go out onto an icy pond or river during the winter, and if the ice is clear enough, what you will see below you in some cases is you will sometimes see turtles just swimming around underneath the ice. And turtles in wintertime can spend really long periods of time. In some cases, they can spend the entire iced over period of the winter underneath the ice in the aquatic environment, never coming up for a breath, because one, they can't, because the pond or the river is iced over. And secondly, they don't really need to, because water temperature is very cold. Their metabolism rate has plummeted so that they're not using a ton of energy, which means that they don't require a ton of oxygen and they don't have to get rid of a ton of CO2. And then the small amount of oxygen that they need to acquire and the small amount of CO2 that they need to get rid of can all be accomplished through cloacal and bucopharyngeal gas exchange. Cloaca is the structure at the back end of the turtle where all of the reproductive and all the urogenital materials exit the body in the cloaca. And once again, bucopharyngeal is the mouth and upper parts of the throat. And so they can get by basically breathing through the cloaca and breathing through their mouth and throat for these time periods when they can't get access to atmospheric air. But generally speaking, in reptiles, lungs are the primary respiratory organs in reptiles. And this causes a number of potential problems. So one of the things that you should think about when you think about any of these things, when you think about amphibians, you can think about, oh, it's great. Amphibians can exchange gases across their skin surface as well as across their lung surface. That's really advantageous because it's just this big respiratory surface out there in the air. But of course, what are the trade-offs of that? So you're getting a lot of gas exchange, but what are the trade-offs for that particular way of getting gases exchanged? Their advantages: the large surface area. You don't have to worry about ventilating your lungs to get gas exchange, but what's the cost of that as an amphibian? think about what type of environments you find amphibians in. Back up a little bit. Why are amphibians called amphibians?
They need water and a moist environment, like, to survive.
Yeah, so one of the costs of having this large respiratory surface that is your skin is it has to maintain moisture in order to facilitate the transfer of gases across it. In the same way that the inside of your lungs are moist but not wet, the skin of an amphibian is moist but not wet necessarily. And the problem with that is that you now lose a lot of moisture from the body through the evaporation of water across that respiratory surface. And so while you might think of amphibians as being at an advantage because they have this large respiratory surface, that respiratory surface is constantly exposed to either air that has a lot of oxygen in it or water where there is a certain amount of oxygen, but certainly there is enough oxygen that you can extract oxygen from the water. But the cost of that is that you have to be in a moist environment so that that surface doesn't dry out. Reptiles are terrestrial for the most part. They've evolved this thick skin that doesn't facilitate cutaneous gas exchange. The nice thing about that is that they don't lose a lot of evaporative water loss across the skin. Remember, their skin resistance is very high. The downside of that is that then they must exchange gases through another mechanism. That primary mechanism is the lung. But now, because the lungs are internal, what are some of the constraints that are placed on reptiles because they're now breathing through the use of lungs rather than just engaging in cutaneous gas exchange? And I just did it. If you guys don't engage any muscles for breathing, what happens to you?
You breathe automatically, or if you don't breathe at all, then you die. I'm sorry, I'm kind of confused with your question.
Yeah, so if you don't breathe, you'll ultimately die. So I had this habit when I was a child. Whenever I couldn't get my way, I would hold my breath until I died. And my mom, because she was at that time a smart mother, she would just let me hold my breath until I died because she knew that I would eventually pass out because I was also a strong-willed child. And as soon as I passed out, my autonomic nervous system would take over the act of breathing for me, even though I was purposefully, as long as I was conscious, preventing myself from breathing. So if you don't breathe, you don't get any oxygen supply going to your lungs. And so one of the problems with, or one of the challenges with having an internal respiratory surface is you have to ventilate that surface. You have to breathe in to bring fresh air in. You have to breathe out to expel stale air that is now made up more of carbon dioxide than it was when it was breathed in as fresh air. And so when lungs are the primary respiratory organ, you have to have mechanisms for ventilating these organs. And that actually has a lot of challenges in reptiles. So among the amphibians that use their lungs for respiration, they generally ventilate their lungs through positive pressure. And what this means is this positive pressure relative to the lungs. So what will happen, and you will see this with frogs, you'll see frogs where their gular pouch, their buccal pouch is fluctuating, it swells up, and then contracts back down, swells up, contracts down, swells up, contracts down. What that frog is doing is it's pulling air in with the buccal, with this air sac here, and then when that air sac contracts, it pushes air into the lungs. So it's filling the lungs not through negative pressure, which is how we do it, but through positive pressure. The buccal region pulls air in, and then when it contracts, it pushes air into the lungs. When the lungs swell up, there's then an elastic response that allows that tissue to come back to its former shape. And so it expels the air through just the elastic response of having the lungs filled. It's kind of like a balloon. As soon as you open up the balloon, the pressure of the sides of the balloon push that air out. And so you fill the lungs by positive pressure from the buccopharynx to fill the lungs, and then the lungs expel air as a result of the elastic properties of the lung. That's different than how you breathe in. When you breathe in, you use your intercostal muscles to make the chest cavity bigger. As your chest cavity gets bigger, that creates negative pressure between the inside of the ribs and the outer layers of the lung, and then that negative pressure basically draws air in to fill the space and equalize that pressure. And then when you go to breathe out, you contract the size of your lungs, and then that increases the pressure, so you now use positive pressure to exhale. And so lizards are the same way. Lizards and snakes are the same way in that they use negative pressure to inflate the lungs, whereas amphibians generally use positive pressure to inflate the lungs. But once again, using negative pressure causes problems. So here is an image of an individual running. As the individual runs, the way lizards run and move their arms, they also have a serpentine motion to their body as they're running. And so as this animal is stretching forward with its right forelimb and pushing off with its back forelimb, it's stretching out the right-hand side of the body. As it stretches out the right-hand side of the body, it creates negative pressure. That negative pressure is also then coupled with, on this side of the body, where the left leg is going back and the left foreleg is going back and the left hind leg is moving forward for the next step, that's contracting this side of the body, the left side of the body, which creates positive pressure. And so air moves from the area of positive pressure to the area of negative pressure. When the converse happens, when it's stretching with its left side creates negative pressure, contracting with the right side creates positive pressure. And so when an animal, when a lizard is moving, is actively locomoting, it's incapable of breathing air in, because the motion of the body moving creates negative positive pressure differentials between the two sides of the lung, such that air just gets shunted from one lung to another rather than being brought in from the outside into the lungs and then expelled again. And so one of the things that you'll see in lizards is that they'll run for short distances and then they'll pause and they'll breathe. And then they'll run for a short distance and then they'll pause and they'll breathe. And it's because they're not capable of inhaling and exhaling while they're in the physical act of running. Now, one of the ways in which lizards have evolved a mechanism around this is they once again use this gular cavity, this cavity in the throat, and they will expand that, creating negative pressure in the anterior portion of the respiratory system. And then they will contract that and use positive pressure to force air into the lungs while they're running. And if you've ever watched a video of a varanid monitor, one of the monitor lizards, they have these very big gular pouches, and you can see their throat swell up and then contract, throat swell up and contract. In this case, what they're doing is they're adopting a positive pressure mechanism similar to what happens in frogs to force air into the lungs when they're unable to bring air into the lungs via negative pressure. And so locomotion in and of itself causes problems with ventilation via negative pressure. And so positive pressure then becomes important during those times. But one of the things that you will see about most lizards is that they don't ever have long sustained bouts of running, of sprinting. They tend to sprint and then rest, sprint and then rest, sprint and then rest. And part of that is due to their inability to ventilate actively while also actively running. Another ventilation constraint is this idea of individuals carrying eggs or carrying embryos. And so this is a skink from Australia. It's one of the stump-tailed skinks. The head is up here. And normally the lungs in the body cavity of this animal extend all the way down to where this arrow is pointing to. But this is one of the skinks that incubates its offspring internally and gives live birth. And you can see that in this image, you can actually see the head of the embryo and the body of the embryo curling around. And because the lung normally in a non-pregnant female extends back this far, the back part of the body of the embryo is actually encroaching on a big chunk of the body cavity that would normally be available to this mother for ventilation. And so what you find in a non-pregnant individual is you see the lungs occupy a large space inside the cavity, but when you begin to have a developing embryo in here, you see that embryo is reducing the total volume of the lungs, and in some cases it's to the point where the right lung is still there and still has quite a lot of volume, and the left lung has been totally squeezed out by, once again, this developing embryo. And once again, that's a constraint imposed by reproduction on an individual's ability to ventilate their lungs. All right. Let's stop and take a break there. Read the chapter on energetic constraints, because we can't come to class and just rely on Elizabeth and Kelsey to answer questions. I'm attempting to be less lectury in my delivery of material, but one of the things that I rely on in an effort to do that is you guys need to come to class prepared to have a less lectury lecture. I can't do lecture in any other way other than just giving you the information if you guys haven't done any work to kind of prepare yourself for class at the beginning. So between now and next time, be sure and have read the information on energetics and performance, and we will pick up here next time. Do you guys have any questions?
Can you upload these slides to Moodle after class?
Oh yeah, did I not do that? I didn't do that earlier, did I?
I didn't see that. I didn't realize
Okay.
that you were already in lecturing, so I just didn't want to interrupt.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to do that. I did it for my earlier class, and I guess I didn't get around to doing it for herpetology. Yep, I'll do that right after we're off here. Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.